This morning, so welcome. My name is Steve Schneck. I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies here at the Catholic University of America, and we are one of today's hosts, and the other host is the African Faith and Justice Network, represented by its executive director here this morning, Father Aniedi Akure. And on behalf of both organizations, we welcome you and thank you very much for attending. The title of today's talk is Ground for Better Understanding and Dialogue with Islam. And we're very pleased and honored this morning to welcome Archbishop Michael L. Fitzgerald. Archbishop Fitzgerald is the Emeritus Nuncio to Egypt. And I think that many of us in this room also know that he has for years been at the crux of the churches, the Catholic Church's interaction with the Muslim world. He's been at the center of efforts to foster dialogue between the Church and Islam. He served in that capacity as Apostolic Nuncio to Egypt, as I just mentioned. He is also, however, the former president of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue and has been a past Vatican delegate to the Arab League. At a time when it seems as if the world's attention is on conflicts and tensions between Islam and Christianity, the African Faith and Justice Network and the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies are especially pleased to be offering today's conversation. What Archbishop Fitzgerald will be speaking about will be deepening and enriching a dialogue and a discourse between these two great religions that goes back for many centuries. Archbishop Fitzgerald.
So first of all, I would like to thank Father Aniedi Akure of the Africa Faith and Justice Network and Dr. Stephen Schneck, Director of the Institute of Policy Research here at Catholic University, for their invitation to talk to you today about dialogue with Muslims. I'm happy that I'm able to be here in this spring because it is the spring break at John Carroll University, where I am for this academic year as the TUI Fellow, and I thank John Carroll for allowing me to come here as well. As attention has just been said, attention is currently focused on, I would say, the so-called Islamic State and different manifestations of violence in some way connected with that newly formed entity. I think it's necessary to say that I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a political scientist. My own training, academic training, was in theology and then in Arabic and Islamics, with the emphasis put on Islam as a religion. But very quickly I moved out of academic life, being involved in the general administration of the Society of Missionaries of Africa, to which I belong, and then, as has been said, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue in the Vatican. And if I did end my service for the Holy See as its representative in Egypt and to the League of Arab States, this was without any formal training as a diplomat. But I hope that my experience will be useful in speaking to you about the possibility of dialogue with Muslims. The grounds of the possibility. Because of these grounds, at the beginning I want to emphasize three elements that may help in understanding the difficulties for dialogue with certain categories of Muslims. First of all, the fundamental difference in the originating experience of Christianity and Islam. And secondly, I want to talk about the attraction of the caliphate. And thirdly, something about Sharia. Sharia, which is proposed as governing society. And after those considerations, it may take some time, so be patient. I will get on to the question of dialogue. So even when making abstraction of the distinctive beliefs of Christians and Muslims, it can be said that there is a great difference in the experience of Jesus and the experience of Muhammad. And so in the foundational experience of these two religions, both Jesus and Muhammad were called to give a message to the world, a message of conversion. And both gathered around them a group of disciples. Yet Jesus preached the kingdom of God, a kingdom which was not of this world. The message of Jesus was essentially religious, although it was and is designed to have an effect on people's behavior in this world. If it were not so, we wouldn't have the policy research. It's true. Muhammad also preached a message which was to bring about a renewal in the Arabia of his time. His message too was essentially religious, the acknowledgement of the one God as against the prevalent polytheism. But it had a social dimension to it, which was to bring about the formation of a new community bound not by blood ties or tribal loyalty, but by religion, a new community which became the Ummah. And the Ummah, perhaps more by accident than design, became at one and the same time a religious and a political community. Maybe I should explain this a little further. Monotheists, because that is the message of Islam, there is one God, but monotheists could be found in Arabia prior to the rise of Islam. There were, first of all, Jewish settlements in different parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and there were also scattered Christians. Christians, too, could be contacted by the Arabs in their caravans that they were going across Christian territories. So trade provided contact with Christians on a wider scale. There would seem to have been a monotheistic movement in Arabia called the Hanafiya prior to Islam, and independent of both Jews and Christians. Now Muhammad brought a message in Arabic for the Arabs. He would seem to have expected that the Arabic-speaking Jews and Christians would accept this monotheistic message and join the new community. And he didn't want this community to be aligned either with the Jews, because the Jews were considered to be allies of the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, or with the Christians, often assimilated to the Byzantines, the Byzantine Empire. The new religious community for Arabs, which was established in Medina, Yathrib, which became Medina, but which considered the Kaaba in Mecca as its fundamental shrine and point of reference, had to fight against the established power in Mecca in order to ensure its survival. As the leader of this community then, Muhammad was at the same time in Montgomery Watt's phrase, both a prophet and a statesman. Now this is very different from Jesus. Jesus had no political role. And very different from the situation of the followers of Jesus, who likewise had no political ambitions. One could say that Christianity, at least until the time of Constantine, was in the nature of a religious opposition movement. It didn't take up arms to fight for survival. So although Christianity was, as it were, taken over and used by political entities, and in the first place by the Byzantines, and then afterwards by various monarchs and rulers, in essence it remains independent of any political power. Correct? So, although Christianity, so it was taken over, but it remained independent. Islam, on the other hand, from its very beginning as a separate community, had been both religious and political. A community whose members have had to struggle in its defense. So you will say, struggle. Now we have reached the topic of jihad. Just a little word of warning here. The term for fighting in the Quran is not jihad. It is qital. Jihad is found only 3 times as such in the Quran. 9:24, where we find an encouragement to struggle in his way. That is, struggle in the way of God. 25:52, which says, Muhammad, do not give in to the disbelievers, but strive against them with it, a great striving. Striving, that is jihad. What is the it? It's usually understood to be the Quran. You fight against the disbelievers with the Quran, with the truth. 61, you who believe, do not take my enemies and yours as your allies. No, not if you truly emigrated in order to strive for my cause and seek my good pleasure. If we take these quotations, we see that jihad does not of itself mean fighting, but making an effort for God and for the community, which may mean preaching the truth according to the Quran or giving of one's wealth on behalf of the cause. As has been said, not all war is jihad, and not all jihad is war. The first Islamic wars were defensive, even when they took on the aspect of offense. Raiding of Meccan caravans could be considered necessary to provide resources for a community that was now excluded from the caravan trade. Resistance to the Meccan forces was normal and lasted until the Islamic community under Muhammad gained control of Mecca. But even after that, some of the Arab tribes that had made alliances with Muhammad and so had become part of the Ummah felt that their allegiance to this Ummah, to this new body, was terminated once Muhammad had died. We had made an alliance with Muhammad. The Muslim leaders after Muhammad, under the Caliph Abu Bakr, couldn't accept this. And they waged against these former allies a war known as the War of the Ridda, or apostasy. And I think that could also be considered a defensive war, because it was for the survival of the community. Jihad, in the sense of war, was engaged regularly against the neighboring Byzantines. But the wars of expansion of the Islamic community are not called jihad by Muslims, by Muslim historiographers, but they're called futuhat, That is the opening up of new countries for Islam. Though the administration of the conquered lands was in Muslim hands, the population of these countries remained non-Islamic for varying periods of length. And sometimes the Christians have remained. In Egypt, where I was, which is majority Muslim, but there is a small minority of, 10 million, it depends whom you ask, of Coptic Orthodox. Some would say 20 million, but statistics vary. There is, I think, in Islamic history a tendency to look back to the first period, the period of the immediate successors to Muhammad, the rightly guided caliphs, as the time of glory and of true Islam. And this has led to a number of revivalist movements. I just want to mention a couple. It's back in history, but they still have a lesson for us, I think. So the Almoravids, the Almorabitun, who established themselves among the Berbers near the Senegal River in West Africa in the 11th century. Their leader, Ibn Tishfin, had discovered true Islam. He was already a Muslim, but he discovered true Islam on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And then he had consolidated this new understanding of the religion through studies in the holy city of Kairouan in Tunisia, present-day Tunisia. And then when he got back, he imposed it in his home area, and he exported it also to Andalusia, that is, to Spain. And there he came into conflict with Christians. But the Almoravid was succeeded by the Almohads. And the name is significant because Almohad means those who are establishing the oneness of God, the uniqueness of God. They were proclaiming a strict worship of the one God without any accretions. And their leader claimed to be the Mahdi, the guided one, who was to bring pure Islam. He was, we might say, preaching the reform of the reform. And though Islam was spread in sub-Saharan West Africa, mainly through trade, the Almoravids, the first movement I mentioned, characterized as a militant Islamic movement in southwestern Sahara, they are credited with bringing about the conversion of the people of Ghana. Since the Muslims of sub-Saharan Africa tended to combine the adopted religion of Islam with their traditional religious practices, jihads became a frequent occurrence. As has been noted by a historian, the dramatic point of no return in the development of Islamic militancy was when the militants reintroduced the concept of takfir. What does that mean? It means declaring as infidels, as kuffar, those who had previously been considered Muslims. And that is something that we hear today as well. I could mention later jihads of Usman Dan Fodio, of Al-Hajj Umar Tal, of Samore Toure, which takes us up to colonial times. But we'll just mention those in passing. But Boko Haram could perhaps be considered of a similar type of movement. It has been pointed out that the leaders of Boko Haram, the majority of them are from the Kanuri ethnic group. The Kanuri were the original inhabitants of northern Nigeria, pushed into a corner by the Hausa and Fulani people. So Boko Haram is in fact, or probably, an instrument being used in the struggle to regain the lost lands of the Kanuri people. A characteristic of these jihads or militant movements of the past is that they were localized. And one would hope that the same could be said of Boko Haram, that their influence was both limited in space and limited in time. After a while, the movement for a pure Islam became softer, and people just went back to their normal way. And then comes another movement. There is another movement for pure Islam which has had a more lasting effect, and that is the Wahhabi movement. The name derived from Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who died in 1791. He based his doctrine of strict Islam on the teaching of a scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah, medieval scholar. The preaching of Tawheed, that is, proclaiming the oneness of God, included for the Wahhabi the abolition of all Sufi practices, the worship of saints, and also the worship of or veneration for holy people, and so tombs and shrines are destroyed. Unlike the jihad movements that I've mentioned before, the Wahhabi movement has survived until today through its association with the Saudi family in Arabia, and the influence of Wahhabism is widely felt. In fact, one could say that the Wahhabi movement has benefited by the phenomenon of globalization, particularly in the realm of communications. And this is true of other militant groups. Today's jihadists are not necessarily limited to particular localities, but are internationally connected and remain in connection, both for the scope of propaganda and also for recruitment. And so we see new groups spring up which claim affiliation to already existing groups, such as Al-Qaeda or the so-called Islamic State. Now the mention of Islamic State brings me to the second point, that is about the caliphate, since the spokesperson for the Islamic State has declared a new caliphate.